This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
I hope everybody is well. My name is Barry Colfer. I'm the Director of Research here at the IIEA. A very warm welcome to this afternoon's webinar on digital society, life online in the shadows of Ireland's tech boom, when Aoife Barry, who will be known to many of you, will discuss her 2023 book, Social Capital, Life Online in the Shadow of Ireland's Tech Boom, published by HarperCollins. The book focuses on what Aoife discovered while interviewing people in Ireland about their online behaviour and how they've been treated online, and what this illustrates about the regulatory and legal challenges facing both social media users and tech owners. I feel the book really holds together in a number of ways, and it feels not just like a tech book from which I learned a lot, but it also feels like a series of stories and kind of a snapshot in time of Irish society. So it's a book I really enjoyed spending time with, and really happy that Aoife is going to discuss it with us today. Excuse me. Aoife is also going to discuss some of the developments since the book's publication. We'll demonstrate how issues around social media and misinformation have only grown to an uncertain and troubling future for the internet. There are chapters on influence, hate and harm, truth and lies, tech in the city, and more, and far more than we'll be able to cover in the space of a short hour. But on a personal note as well, this book feels very familiar for someone who kind of started school in the late 80s, 90s, before the internet was a thing. And then by the time I finished it, dial-up internet and the dawn of what we now know and feel so familiar. So the book really feels like kind of familiar to me, given my age and my life experience. Aoife is a freelance journalist and broadcaster. Her essays and fiction have been published by Banshee Journal, ThiWurd, and Visual Verse, and she's been broadcast on RTÉ's Sunday Miscellany, the soundtrack for many a Sunday morning. Aoife is former assistant news editor at the journal.ie, and her bylines include the Sunday Times, the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, the Business Post, the Journal, and the Irish Examiner. Aoife features regularly on RTÉ and Today FM, and has received Agility Award funding from the Arts Council for a novel in progress, and was selected by the Irish Writers' Centre for its Evolution Programme 2023. Aoife, it's a real pleasure to have you here, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Barry, and thanks so much to everybody that's giving up an hour of their day to listen to me talk about my book. I'm just going to share a slideshow that I hope will keep people's attention as well as you having to listen to me for the next hour. So hopefully you can all see that there. I'm actually just going to go close that and just go back to the very start with there now before I can start talking. But like I said, like I was saying, this particular book came out in 2023, and I just wanted to start at the start of this by talking about kind of going back to the very beginning of the internet. So let me just share at the start of the slideshow now, which I have just rapidly pulled together for you. So hopefully we can all see this. Sorry. Oh my gosh. Speaking of talking about the internet, it sometimes fails us. Here we go. Yeah. I think they put those two buttons too close together. So I'm going to be talking about my book, Social Capital. It's backwards here on your screen. Came out in 2023. I was nominated for an Irish Book Award, which was a real honor. So I think starting talking about social media and the impact of social media and the people I talk to in the book, you have to start really at the very beginning in terms of the internet and social media and where it all began. So very briefly, I think if we could all get ourselves situated back in the days that some of us will be familiar with. I know I'm very familiar with it, but some people watching won't be. And that's that idea of, the dialing in days or the dialing up to the internet days, when you chose to go onto the internet, when you went into your kitchen, as it was in my house in Cork growing up, in the late 90s, or maybe it was you were lucky to have a computer in your bedroom and your parents weren't keeping an eye on what you're up to, or maybe you had it in the living room or something like that, and you were choosing to go on the internet. And so you probably remember at that time seeing these sorts of things like chat rooms, or the later early versions of what we now call social media, like myspace.com. I used to spend a lot of time in chat rooms with my friends whenever I went online, and I was so fascinated by everything that I saw there. A lot of the times because it was so kind of transient and ephemeral. I'd go on and I'd be on this random chat room. I'd usually just search on Alta Vista, which is Google didn't even exist back then, for the words chat room, and just find a random chat room and go talk to these people. It inevitably ended up being people from Australia or different countries that I knew I'd never talk to again for the rest of my life. There's something very appealing and interesting about that. So keeping in mind, I think that idea of we used to choose to go online, we used to choose to be in contact with people, but it was very kind of ephemeral often. And moving then to say 2007, when the iPhone came out and we suddenly had this explosion in smartphone ownership, and that idea that now being online and being on social media is just a very normal part of your day, that it's really easy to access the internet. In fact, it's really hard not to access the internet, the complete opposite to what it was, 20 or so years ago. So when I, was young and a teenager, I didn't realize I'd end up working on the internet. And in 2011, I started writing for the journal.ie and eventually became assistant news editor there and a reporter. And so I saw social media grow, and I saw its role and its importance in terms of how individuals interacted with it and how journalists interacted with it really grow. And I could see the importance of social media as a particular phenomenon culturally, which brings me to Social Capital, my book. So in 2021, during COVID, HarperCollins Ireland approached me and asked me, did I want to write about social media? So, of course, having spent a lot of time on it for the previous decade or more, I was really excited about writing about it. And they wanted to concentrate on Ireland and Ireland's story and how Irish people are impacted and have been impacted by social media. But it's such a huge thing, right? It's absolutely massive. They also wanted me to write a little bit about the impact in Ireland of things like Silicon Docks, that area down in the Docklands that was regenerated thanks to Facebook and then other tech companies moving in. Whether or not you think that was a good thing or not, of course, you might agree or disagree with whether that was good. But that was also something that they wanted included. And I went home and I thought I'd love to write about this book, but I was trying to figure out how to write this. I knew that I had, the background to write it, but I knew that I had to speak to other people. And so I turned to our Lord and Savior, Joan Didion, and I thought, okay, it has to be about telling people's stories, right? Is a really famous quote from her book, her collection, The White Album, where she says, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Now, that's very dramatic, and my book isn't necessarily about that, but it is about telling people's stories and finding the human stories, because I really feel that the only way you can talk about the impact of social media and the only way you can understand it is through talking to the people who use it. So I set off to do a number of interviews with people. I'm not going to go through all of the interviews over the next little while, but I am going to talk to you about a couple of them. Also going to talk about a chapter that I wrote about myself and my experience, and then I'm going to move into the future of social media and the current challenges. So I'm going to try and cram a load of stuff into the next kind of 15 or so minutes. So with my very fast talking Cork accent. So please bear with me, but I hope that you glean some interesting things from these stories. The first is the protest. I opened the book with a story about these young people. There was a group of them. They came from Schull in Cork all the way to Leinster House because they were having serious issues with Facebook and Instagram and what they felt were the impacts of these platforms on their lives as young kids, young teenagers, mostly girls growing up in Cork. They felt, we're seeing a lot of impact here, and we believe that the company Facebook needs to do something about the negative impacts on young people. And I was so impressed with them, and that's why I opened the book with them, because not only did they feel these things, they went all the way to Leinster House to try and talk to the Minister, Catherine Martin, about it. And when I was a teenager, not only did I not have the internet in my life like they do now, and I didn't have those same pressures, but I probably couldn't have told you where Leinster House was, to be honest. I certainly wouldn't have known that I could have gone up there and protested outside it. And I just wouldn't have had the wherewithal to realize that as a young person, I could do that. And what that also taught me was that they are learning from people that they're seeing on social media. There's this positive impact. They're seeing Greta Thunberg starting her climate protests every Friday and not going to school and speaking to political figures globally. So it showed me that teenagers in particular are getting loads of great things from being online and loads of negative impacts too. And I felt those two threads were what we're really carrying through the book. And so I opened it with their story. Now, as you can imagine, not a huge amount changed after they did that. And that's also a theme too. Like, what is the actual impact of our protests or people's protests? But I still think it's really important for people to speak about their experience, because change can only come after that. Here's a quote that some of the teenagers said to me. They basically said that, Facebook was making so much money off its products that it's not going to stop or change what it's doing, and that they felt it was up to the government to protect them. And it was just so impressive that they wanted to protect other young people as well as themselves in terms of the impact of social media as a whole. Another story that I tell in the book is the story of Coco's Law, which is legislation that came in 2020. And this beautiful young girl in the photograph, her name is Nicole Fox, and she sadly took her life in around 2018. And her story is widely reported online. You can read more in the book as well. But I spoke to her mother, Jackie Fox, about her daughter, about her campaigning for this law, because her daughter was bullied in real life and she was also cyberbullied. And after her tragic death, her mother really saw there was a big gap there in terms of how people are taken into account for what happens to people online. So if you're cyberbullied, where do you go? Who can take care of you? Who can do anything about it? And she did a lot of contacting different politicians, and she ended up teaming up with the Labour TD Brendan Howlin, and he was drafting a bill at that time, and they really pushed forward for this. And luckily, there was a big appetite for it, or a certain appetite for it in government at the time. They met with the Minister Helen McEntee, and Jackie told her story and Coco's story. And in the end, this bill came out, this act came out, the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offences Act, which covered cyberbullying, but also crimes that are really growing, like sharing intimate images without consent. And what was really big for Jackie was that it was given the subtitle of Coco's Law, which is the first time in Ireland that there's ever been a law that's had a person's name. You know, in the UK, that would be fairly common, but we've never had it in Ireland before. And it really showed that link between the person and the fact that there are, this toxic behavior and potentially crimes happening online too. Another story that I told is that of the Ryan family. I spoke to Fiona Ryan, who's there in the left of the photograph, with her partner, Jonathan. And they weren't even really heavily on social media and were the recipients of very racist and toxic behavior, because they appeared in a little ad with their son. And there was people on Twitter and Facebook and other platforms who were really unhappy with the fact that a multicultural family was pictured in little billboards and little ads. The company was really supportive of the family, by the way, and they tweeted about it and they really showed their support. But for Fiona, she told me that she basically had to go and call to the Gardaí, ask them if there's anything that could be done. And then the Gardaí said to her, you need to print out every single example you can find of the abuse online and hand them to us, and then we see what we can do. And in the end, nothing could be done. I think really there was probably too many people involved, and there wasn't the capability to narrow it down to being able to charge one person with the crime. But the impact on Fiona and her family was huge. I mean, here's a quote from her. She felt really terrified that individuals could have hate towards her child as well. And she was really terrified that there could be real life impacts of that hatred that was being shown on the social media platforms. She was, such a great person to interview, because she was really eloquent about how she felt and the impact on them, and the fact there's this massive gap there between kind of, what is happening online and what could actually be done about it. Then I write 2 chapters in the book where I speak about my experience, where myself and 5 other women were harassed by an internet troll who spent quite a number of years emailing us using multiple email accounts. I think he used 6 at the last count. He impersonated some people via email as well, and generally made us all feel extremely unsafe. And he was jailed in the end. He spent 3 years in jail. And I wanted to write about my experience because I felt that actually I wasn't too sure about how I felt about the carceral element of this, and the fact that, you're looking at a situation with online harassment, and is there nothing between doing nothing and sending a person to jail? And does, sending a person to prison actually have an impact on their behavior? Does it send a message? Does it rehabilitate people in any way? But I also wanted to share what had happened with myself and the other 2 women that I spoke to, about how we felt and about the impact of that on us. And I felt that was important to share with people, even though it's really hard to talk about these kind of things, I think, publicly. And after the book came out, the man in question was back in court because he'd actually been charged with breaching the bail conditions after he was arrested in connection with harassing us. And I think that really taught me that these stories and situations like harassment can have a very long tail. And the fact that people are back and forth in court multiple times, like we were, can be really, really draining on people. And while we were able to an extent deal with that, I can imagine there's other people who wouldn't want to be going through that experience at all. So it made me see the gaps that were there. And then another chapter, before I move on to my learnings, was about misinformation. And I mentioned this here because it plays a big part in, the current challenges and the future of social media. And you can see here a text that I'm sure a load of you got who are watching here about the alleged crackdown around COVID-19 times. This would have been sent in like very early 2020, probably late March, even mid-March, about a hotel allegedly going on lockdown and about different cases of COVID-19. So maybe actually it was probably even before the country shut down. And this was a huge part of my job when I worked in the journal with the other editors and writers. We were all constantly observing the sort of content that was being sent to WhatsApp, and people were debunking and fact checking it. And we were watching misinformation grow and grow and grow. And in the book, I write about that particular experience and what it taught me. And I speak to other experts about it, including the deputy editor of the journal, Christine Bowen, about what she observed, leading the fact-checking project. And herself and the other experts all said this was a real catalyst and a really big moment that stemmed from the Trump era, when there was quite a big spread of misinformation, and the fake news era, and that they were worried about where things were going to go in the future. So I'll speak a little bit about that in a second. But I thought it was so important to have that chapter about misinformation. And as you can see, Aoife Gallagher is a quote here from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. And she, at the very last line of this slide, she says, but Gallagher warns that there isn't room for complacency around misinformation. She says, you just don't know what's going to happen in the future. And indeed, her words were absolutely borne out. And these clips are all taken from the book, so you can find those in the chapter there too. So just to go to my learnings quickly, the interview learnings that I got from speaking to other people, to go back to that idea of those two tracks, people can be harmed and can be helped by social media. Seems really obvious in a way to say, but I think it's important to hold that in mind, these two quite opposing things, and that's why we keep going online, because of the good stuff. But how do we deal with the negative impacts of social media? A lot of interviewees felt there was very little clarity around how the law or the Gardaí could help them. Even if there was legislation in place, they might not have known about it. They might not have known they could go to the Gardaí. And sometimes they went and spoke to Gardaí, and the Gardaí at that time in 2020, 2021, didn't really know what to do about what they were coming to them with. So felt that was a big gap for them at that time. A lot of people felt very alone and not listened to. It's hard to talk about online impacts of behavior or impacts of behavior online on you in real life, because it can be hard to describe that. And some people don't maybe understand what you're talking about. And especially if you don't feel like anything can be done, and if you feel like the social media platform isn't going to do anything, you're certainly going to feel alone. And I also found that anonymity both helps and harms people. It's really great for people like Aoife Martin, who I interviewed, who's a trans woman who really needed that anonymity online. And yet it can also harm people. In fact, it harmed her because she was then a recipient of toxic behavior when she spoke about being a trans woman online. So she was getting both the positives and negatives just by being on the internet, just by being on social media, should I say. Further learnings were that COVID changed the game for misinformation, absolutely, that it just mushroomed really at that time. And also that toxic content on social media is directly impacted by the rules and enforcement on the site. So if you are a social media platform and you're not really enforcing rules around things like suspending people, or you don't suspend people, or if you're not really enforcing things like allowing people to block people easily, or the users really feel like that they're not getting enough when they try and complain or flag toxic behavior, then those people are going to feel unsafe on your platform. But what you're also doing, if you don't block people, if you don't kind of get rid of people or suspend them, or you don't make the rules clear around what's allowed and what isn't on your platform, you're basically allowing people and kind of giving them the green flag in terms of behave however you want. It doesn't really matter because nothing's going to happen about it. And we're seeing a lot of that happening on one particular platform at the moment that I'll mention in a second. But I could really see how the content and how the social media sites deal with it really impacts on individuals and can impact on them in such a difficult way. And then I also found that the law and regulation were really catching up. We saw a lot of change around the time I was writing the book and the book came out. The OSMR bill, DSA, things like that. Europe and Ireland was making these changes in terms of trying to, come to terms with the impact of social media. Commission the Man was set up as well, but those impacts weren't necessarily impacting on people on a day-to-day individual basis. So if we move on then just quickly to my experience and the learnings, I touched on these already, I think, a bit, but there was a lack of solutions, really. Like, it felt like there was nothing was going to happen if you're harassed, or the person potentially could go to jail. And it felt like there was a big gap there. The key from our case, I think, was there was one perpetrator and they were able to be traced, and they were harassing a number of people. And that made that case easier to progress than if you're online and you're harassed by huge number of people and they're not easy to contact. That's the difference between our case and perhaps say Fiona Ryan's experience. The Gardaí took the case really seriously from the get-go. And I also found that the impact on myself and the other women could be really huge, depending on the person. I didn't want to speak for everybody, but that's why I interviewed two of the other women. And between the three of us, we all were able to talk about the impacts on us. And in some cases, they could be particularly huge and change your relationship with the internet forever, really, and your relationship with social media in particular. So reflecting on all of that, and I've given you loads of information there, what is the impact on the future of social media? Looking at the kind of things that have changed between when I brought out the book in April 2023 and now. So the number of social media users this is from Statista. It's projected to go to about 6 billion in a couple of years. At the moment, it's well over 5.5. It's well over 5.1 billion. So the numbers aren't projected to go down. We're just going to see more and more people using social media globally. And that, of course, is what platforms want and what they're working on doing. Meanwhile, two owners of two of the most major platforms in terms of their reach and their cultural power as well. We've got Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. They're making a huge amount of money. They're billionaires with a lot of power. So they want to keep hold of that power, and they want to have their say on how their platforms develop. So the users are growing, the amount of money the platforms are making is growing in a really simplistic way. And I wanted to just briefly focus on Twitter for a second, which is now called X. But Twitter was taken over by Elon Musk, and he became the supreme leader of X, and he changed that social media platform almost instantly. You saw rollbacks on trust and safety, which has an impact on moderation for users. And I think anybody who's watching this that's a regular X user or Twitter user can definitively say that they could have given you the results of this particular study in the University of Southern California, and told you that, yes, the new Twitter does have a lot more hate on it, that hate speech has significantly increased across all of our feeds. And that is a direct impact from the top person that is running the site, and not because he's going around spreading all the hate, but because he believes in the power of free speech, and he also has certain political ideals, and that filters through how the company is run, and then that has a direct impact on us as users. And then I really wanted to draw people's attention to this study that I think people should absolutely read. It's by the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, and it highlights what I predicted in the book, and most people I think who or anybody who's been looking at this subject will have predicted, which is that misinformation was going to grow from the COVID era, and that we are seeing an absolute rise in mis and disinformation at the moment. Some of their findings include that the influence of the far right in Ireland is growing. We see that in the news every day. Tech companies, they say, are failing to enforce community guidelines, which goes back to stuff I discussed in the book, and that emboldens the far right, that the level of the sort of toxic activity is growing. Most of it, according to the study, is on X, and that Telegram is a key platform. Now, we could spend another few hours talking about platforms like Telegram and WhatsApp, which are encrypted and more of a siloed off kind of social media-ish platform for people to connect, but I think they really draw attention to those key points in that study, and I would really recommend people go seek that out. They also found that hateful ideologies spread with ease, and again, that COVID-19 was a catalyst for mis and disinformation. And of course, we're seeing this all the time at the moment, that online discussions fuel offline hostility and violence. We literally see this all the time. And so just to go to the challenges based off this study and based off the kind of learnings that I found through writing my book, and I think none of this is going to be a surprise to, I think, anybody really who's been paying attention to the news and who's watching this, is that huge challenge constantly is misinformation and disinformation. It is just becoming, such a powerful force in the online social media experience for users right now. It's really worrying. Yesterday I was on one of the social media platforms that I hadn't been on in a while, and I was served up a video really quickly of 3 American men talking about the Irish situation with international protection applicants, and the amount of misinformation in that one video presented as fact absolutely blew my mind. And when I sought out their other content, I could see that they were just hoovering up little bits of information and creating a whole new narrative with it, and that was being pushed out to people globally, and that was just one tiny example of what we're seeing online at the moment. The rise of far-right actors, AI is going to be a massive challenge, and is currently a massive challenge, particularly with elections and particularly with the ability to create disinformation via video, via image. It's just one of the biggest things really that is a challenge, I think, globally, not just in social media, but in terms of democracy in general. The impact of concentrated power of one owner. If Mark Zuckerberg turns around tomorrow and decides he wants to change radical ways of how Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp work, we as individuals will be directly impacted by a change in his politics or a change in moderation or anything that he decides to change. And he has ultimate power with his company too. And then finally, another challenge is media literacy. And I do think media literacy is a huge amount of work being done to improve it. But because the misinformation has been increasing so much, it's even more of a challenge to get to people. I'm probably not the only person who's seen friends and people they know or acquaintances online share messages and share videos and share things online that you're pretty sure they wouldn't have shared a couple of years ago, that they would have had a little bit more kind of context searching, or they would have been a little bit more cynical, and that now they're actually sharing things because of things like, confirmation bias. I think that media literacy aspect is a really big challenge. Just these headlines highlight, I think, what we're seeing around all of those challenges. Warnings about deep fake threats, debunked audio praising Irish protesters, a Russian propaganda network. You can read about that on the Journal and on the Edmo website as well. And having to debunk things like AI images that are going around about standoffs at those very unfortunately regular protests. And my final slide, amongst all the information I've given you so far, is solutions. And I put a question mark because I'm not going to put myself forward as someone who has the ultimate solution to any of this. But when I think about where the potential solutions might lie, based on reading other people's work, thinking about it myself, and what I was told in the book, better enforcement all around by the platforms. But that does come down to whether the platforms want to enforce certain rules and whether they even want to have certain rules in place in the first place. If they treasure free speech, then you probably won't have many rules in place necessarily to be enforced around that. Algorithmic control by those platforms, again, you're actually depending on them to not want to amplify certain voices. Fact checking and debunking are massively important. We've got great outlets, including my former employer, the Journal. Fact checking, really, really important stuff. And that is just such a key part, I think, of fighting misinformation. Researchers need to access data, because only by accessing the kind of data that the platforms hold about their user base and about the work they do can we see researchers dig into that and then propose more solutions. We need to listen to social media users, and we also need to focus on media literacy, both I think on a policy basis, but actually on an individual basis too. I found even myself being out of the newsroom on a day-to-day basis, I have to really make sure that I'm keeping up on what's true and what's not. And if I'm doing that as someone who has fact-checked things, then I know people who've never fact-checked things might not realize that that's something they also have to keep up with. And the Journal Fact Check Knowledge Bank is a really good example of where you can look up different things that you might be curious about or you might not have the info on. So I think I've probably got a little bit over time, but it's a big, big topic, and I hope that people found that interesting. There's a quote in the end of the book, which you can read, but it sums up what I said there. And then that's a photograph of my book, because it's good to plug Social Capital. If anybody wants to pick it up, it looks like that on the shelves. So thanks so much for listening to me, and thanks for the space as well too.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.